Think about what you ate for dinner 2 or 3 nights ago. There is a reasonable chance some version of it is still in your fridge right now. Rice, maybe, leftover chicken, something fried or roasted. And there is an equally reasonable chance you have already reheated it once, possibly twice, without giving it a second thought. I need you to sit with that for a moment, because what I am about to tell you is not something your doctor brought up at your last checkup. It is not something the food safety guidelines printed on the side of a container will warn you about. And it is almost certainly not part of any conversation you have had about your long-term health. If you are over 35, the habits you have built around reheating food are quietly doing something to your body that will not show up in any obvious way for years, possibly a decade. And by the time it does show up, the accumulation has already been happening for a very long time. I am Dr. Megan Foster. I have spent 24 years in surgical medicine. And when I look at the patterns in patients dealing with chronic inflammation, metabolic stress, and pancreatic disease, what I see almost never traces back to one dramatic dietary failure. It traces back to something much quieter, something that happened in their kitchen, repeatedly, without any awareness that it was a problem at all. Reheated rice, reheated chicken, reheated potatoes, and fried food. These are not dramatic villains. They are Tuesday night dinner, and that is exactly why this is so easy to miss. Here is what no one explains. When certain foods are exposed to repeated cycles of heat, their chemistry changes in ways that create a slow, consistent source of oxidative stress inside your body. Not a fire, a slow, invisible friction. And your pancreas, which works silently every single day to regulate your blood sugar and your digestion, is sitting directly in the path of that friction. The mainstream conversation about diet focuses almost entirely on what you eat. Processed food, sugar, saturated fat. Those conversations have their place, but almost no one is talking about what happens to food after it has already been cooked once and what repeated reheating actually does to the compounds your body has to process. The research on this is not new. The World Health Organization has classified certain heat-formed compounds as probable carcinogens. The science on oxidized fats and their role in chronic inflammation is well established, but it never makes it into the everyday conversation because it is not dramatic enough for a headline. And it does not fit the simple story of good food versus bad food. What it does fit is the story of a habit most adults over 35 have repeated hundreds or thousands of times by now, without ever being told that the how and how many times matters just as much as the what. I am not going to tell you to stop eating leftovers. I am not going to tell you everything you have been doing is wrong. What I am going to do is show you exactly which 5 foods carry the highest risk when reheated incorrectly, what is actually happening inside your body each time you do it, and why the next 10 to 20 years of that pattern is a conversation worth having right now before there is any reason to have it urgently. Stay with me, because the one at the top of this list is something almost every household reheats every single week. Now let me give you the foundation before we get into the list, because understanding the why makes everything else click into place. Your pancreas is a small organ, about 6 inches long, tucked behind your stomach. Most people never think about it unless something goes wrong, and that is part of the problem. It does 2 jobs every single day without you feeling it at all. It produces digestive enzymes that help break down the food you eat, and it regulates your blood sugar by producing insulin. It is constantly working, constantly responding to what you put into your body. Now imagine sending that organ a low level of irritation every single day. Not a big dramatic event, not a single toxic meal, just a consistent, low-grade daily source of chemical stress over months and years. That is what we are talking about today. When certain foods are reheated, especially repeatedly, they go through chemical changes. Fats oxidize. Certain compounds that were harmless before cooking become problematic after repeated heat exposure. Bacteria in some foods produce toxins that survive even after reheating destroys the bacteria themselves. And when your body has to process these things again and again, the result is something called oxidative stress and chronic low-grade inflammation. Inflammation is not always dramatic. You do not always feel it. It is not always a fever or swelling you can see. Sometimes it is just a quiet background process, like friction on a machine that was not designed to run with that much friction. Over time, that friction wears things down. And the pancreas, because of its extremely sensitive role in digestion and blood sugar regulation, is particularly vulnerable to that kind of long-term wear. Long-term research has consistently linked chronic inflammatory load and oxidative stress with increased risk of pancreatic disease. The World Health Organization classifies certain heat-formed compounds, including nitrosamines, as probable carcinogens. The International Agency for Research on Cancer has classified acrylamide, which forms in starchy foods cooked at high temperatures, as a probable carcinogen based on years of accumulated exposure data. Now, I want to be very clear about something before we go any further. These classifications are not about panic. They are not saying one meal will harm you. They are about cumulative exposure over time. Dose and frequency matter enormously. A single reheated potato is not going to damage your pancreas. But if we are talking about daily habits that have been in place for 10, 15, 20 years, that is a completely different conversation. This is not about living in fear. This is not about throwing your leftovers in the trash every night. This is about understanding the mechanism and making small, smart adjustments that reduce your long-term exposure to these compounds. And here's the part that I really want you to hold on to. This is not genetic destiny. For most people, this kind of chronic inflammatory load is not something they were born with. It is something that built up through unconscious daily habits, which means awareness changes everything. Small adjustments to when and how you reheat food can meaningfully reduce your body's inflammatory burden over time. That is an empowering idea, and it is why this conversation matters. So let us get into the list. We are starting at number 5 and working our way up to number 1, which is the one that surprises almost everyone. Number 5 on our list is leafy greens. And I already know what some of you are thinking. Vegetables? You are telling me vegetables are on this list? Stay with me because this one is about storage and temperature cycling, not about the greens themselves. Spinach, kale, chard, and other leafy greens naturally contain nitrates. Nitrates on their own are not a major concern. Your body actually converts small amounts of nitrate into nitric oxide, which has some beneficial effects on circulation. So in their raw or freshly cooked state, leafy greens are genuinely healthy foods. But here is what changes. When cooked leafy greens are not cooled down quickly after cooking, or when they are stored improperly at the wrong temperature, the nitrates in those greens begin to convert into nitrites. And when nitrites interact with certain proteins, particularly in a warm environment during repeated reheating, they can form compounds called nitrosamines. Nitrosamines are classified by the World Health Organization as probable carcinogens, and the conditions that encourage their formation are exactly the conditions that happen in the average kitchen. Cooked spinach sitting out for a couple of hours before being put in the fridge, leftovers being stored in a container that was not fully sealed, greens being reheated more than once over several days. The issue is not the vegetable itself. The issue is the temperature cycling that happens after it has been cooked. Every time cooked greens go from warm to cool to warm again, you are creating conditions where those chemical conversions can happen more efficiently. So what is the practical fix here? It is simple. Cool your cooked greens down quickly after they come off the heat. Do not let them sit on the counter for 2 hours before refrigerating. Get them into a sealed container and into the fridge within an hour of cooking and reheat them once. Just once. If you are not going to eat all of it in one sitting, portion it out before you reheat it so you are only heating what you are going to consume right then. The common mistake I see is leaving a big batch of cooked spinach in a warm pot on the stove while the family eats dinner, and then putting that warm pot directly into the fridge an hour and a half later. By that point, the temperature cycling has already been working on those nitrates for longer than ideal. Small adjustment, significant difference over time. Now let us move to number 4. And this one is a staple in almost every household everywhere in the world. Number 4 is chicken. Cooked chicken is one of the most commonly stored and reheated proteins, and it comes with a risk that most people dramatically underestimate. The misconception here is this: if chicken is cooked once all the way through, it is safe to eat for several days as long as it has been refrigerated. And that is mostly true for food safety purposes. But the issue with reheating chicken specifically is not just about whether it was cooked correctly the first time, it is about whether it is reheated correctly and evenly the second time. Chicken, especially in thick portions or pieces with bone, reheats extremely unevenly in a microwave. The outside of a chicken breast can reach a temperature that feels hot to the touch, while the center is still only lukewarm. And lukewarm is a problem. Bacteria, like salmonella, need a certain internal temperature to be destroyed. If you are not reaching that temperature consistently throughout the entire piece of meat, you are not neutralizing the risk. Now, the conversation I want to have here goes beyond just food poisoning, which is the obvious concern most people already know about. What I want to talk about is the secondary effect: low-grade, recurring gastrointestinal distress from improperly reheated chicken, even if it never results in a dramatic case of food poisoning, creates a cycle of low-level immune activation in your gut. Your gut is home to an enormous portion of your immune system. When it is repeatedly dealing with even small amounts of bacterial exposure from improperly reheated food, your immune system responds. And that immune response, sustained over time, contributes to systemic inflammation, the kind of inflammation that puts stress on every organ in your body, including your pancreas, which is right there in the neighborhood. The fix for chicken is straightforward. When you reheat it, do not just heat until the outside feels warm. Make sure you are reaching a safe internal temperature throughout the entire piece. If you are using a microwave, cut thicker pieces into smaller portions before heating, or use the rotation function and stop to stir or flip partway through. Let it rest for a full minute after heating, because heat continues to distribute through the food during that resting period. And if you have a food thermometer, use it. Safe internal temperature for reheated poultry is 165 degrees Fahrenheit or 74 degrees Celsius, and store your cooked chicken properly. Get it into the fridge within 2 hours of cooking, sealed tightly, and aim to consume it within 3 to 4 days. Do not push it to day 6 and reheat it for the third time, wondering if it smells okay. Number 3 is one that surprises almost everyone when I explain the specific risk, because most people think of rice as one of the safest, most neutral foods you can eat. Number 3 is rice. Rice has a unique problem that has nothing to do with the rice itself and everything to do with a specific type of bacteria called Bacillus cereus. This bacteria is naturally present in the environment and commonly found in uncooked rice. When rice is cooked, most bacteria are killed. But Bacillus cereus produces spores, and spores are incredibly resilient. They can survive the cooking process. Here is where it gets interesting and honestly a little alarming. When cooked rice is left out at room temperature for more than an hour or two, those spores germinate into active bacteria. And as the bacteria grow, they produce toxins. These toxins are heat stable. That means that even if you then reheat the rice to a perfectly safe temperature and kill all the bacteria, the toxins they produced are still there. Reheating does not destroy them. So you can reheat rice until it is steaming hot. It smells fine, it looks fine, it tastes fine, and those toxins are still present and will still affect your digestive system. In mild cases, this causes nausea, cramping, and diarrhea. In more significant exposures, particularly in people with vulnerable immune systems, the effects can be considerably worse. The critical mistake that happens in almost every household is leaving cooked rice out on the counter or in the rice cooker at warm temperature for hours after it is done cooking. People finish dinner, leave the rice cooker on warm mode, or just put a lid on the pot on the stove and come back to it hours later. By that point, the bacteria have had ideal conditions to grow and produce toxins. The rule with rice is simple and non-negotiable. Get cooked rice into the fridge within 1 hour of finishing cooking. If you cannot do that, it should not be saved. Portion what you need, refrigerate the rest immediately, and when you reheat it only once. Once. Do not take refrigerated rice, heat a portion, put the rest back, heat another portion the next day, and repeat. Each heating cycle that involves leaving warm rice out at room temperature, even briefly, is another opportunity for that toxin production cycle to begin. And store rice in shallow containers rather than deep ones. Shallow containers allow the rice to cool down faster and more evenly in the fridge, which reduces the window of time during which bacterial growth is most likely. Now we are moving into the top two, and these are different from the previous three in an important way. The concerns with leafy greens, chicken, and rice are primarily about bacterial activity and the compounds that bacteria produce. The concerns with our top two are about chemistry, about what happens to the food itself at a molecular level when it is exposed to repeated cycles of high heat. And this is where the conversation about long-term oxidative stress and chronic inflammation becomes most direct. Number two is potatoes and starchy foods, particularly when they are reheated at high temperatures. Here is the mechanism. When starchy foods like potatoes are cooked at high temperatures, especially when they are baked, roasted, or fried, a chemical reaction occurs between the natural sugars and amino acids in the starch. This reaction produces a compound called acrylamide. Acrylamide is not unique to potatoes. It forms in any starchy food that is cooked at high heat. Bread crusts, crackers, breakfast cereals, coffee, French fries, potato chips, roasted nuts. But potatoes reheated in an oven or pan until they are crispy again are one of the most concentrated sources of acrylamide exposure in a typical diet. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is one of the most rigorous classification bodies in the world, has classified acrylamide as a probable human carcinogen based on extensive research in animal models and epidemiological studies. The reason the classification is probable rather than definitive is that human studies are difficult to conduct perfectly, but the weight of evidence is substantial. What makes this relevant to our conversation is the cumulative nature of the exposure. If you are eating reheated fries, reheated roasted potatoes, reheated hash browns, or any kind of re-crisped starchy food on a regular basis, week after week, year after year, you are adding a consistent amount of acrylamide to your body's daily oxidative load. Acrylamide works partly by creating oxidative stress inside cells. It reacts with proteins and DNA in ways that can contribute to cellular damage over time. And while the body has repair mechanisms for this kind of damage, those mechanisms have limits. When the exposure is chronic and consistent, it can overwhelm those repair systems. The practical rule here is not about never eating roasted potatoes. It is about how you reheat them. The darker and crispier a starchy food gets during reheating, the more acrylamide it contains. A lightly warmed potato has dramatically less acrylamide than one that has been roasted until golden brown a second time. So if you are reheating potatoes, do it gently. Lower heat, shorter time. Stop well before they start to brown and crisp up again. Your goal is warm, not crunchy. Also consider the method. Reheating in a microwave, as much as people dislike the texture it produces in fried or roasted foods, actually generates significantly less acrylamide than reheating in a hot oven or pan because the temperature stays lower. So if texture matters less to you than health in that moment, the microwave is actually the better choice for starchy leftovers. And now we arrive at number one, the most impactful item on this list. The one that is present in nearly every household in some form. The one that creates the most direct and measurable increase in oxidative stress when handled incorrectly. Number one is reheated oils and fried foods. Let me explain what happens to oil when it is heated. Fresh oil, whether it is vegetable oil, sunflower oil, canola oil, or any other common cooking oil, has a relatively stable chemical structure. When it is heated for the first time to cooking temperature, some changes occur, but the oil largely maintains its basic character. But when oil is heated again and again, something fundamentally different happens. the fatty acid chains in the oil begin to break down through a process called oxidation. This produces a range of compounds, including aldehydes and lipid peroxides. These are reactive molecules that behave very differently inside your body than fresh, stable fats. Oxidized fats are a significant source of oxidative stress when consumed. When you eat food that was cooked in repeatedly heated oil, or when you reheat fried food so that the fat in the coating or the absorbed oil heats again, your body absorbs those oxidized compounds. And once inside, they contribute to inflammation in a way that fresh fats simply do not. Multiple metabolic research studies have linked consumption of oxidized fats to increased inflammatory markers in the blood. Elevated inflammatory markers are associated with a wide range of chronic diseases, including cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, and conditions involving the liver and pancreas. Here is what makes this particularly widespread as a problem. Think about how fried food is reheated in the average home. Leftover fried chicken or schnitzel goes into a pan with a bit more oil and gets heated up again. The oil from the original cooking is still in or on the food, and the new oil in the pan is being added to the mix and heated again. Or leftover fries go into a hot oven and the oil they were originally fried in heats again inside each fry. Restaurant and commercial settings are actually where this issue is most severe. Deep fryers in many restaurants use the same oil for hours or days before it is changed. By the end of a long service, that oil has been heated hundreds of times. Every batch of food that comes out of it is cooked in increasingly oxidized oil. And when you take those leftovers home and reheat them the next day, you are adding yet another heating cycle to oil that was already significantly degraded. The practical changes here are actually quite straightforward. When cooking at home, do not reuse frying oil multiple times. 1 or 2 uses is reasonable for some higher quality oils with high smoke points, but repeated reheating of the same oil is where the oxidation becomes significant. Discard it and start fresh. When reheating fried food, lower heat and shorter time, reduce additional oxidation compared to going back into a very hot pan or a very hot oven. And honestly, if your primary concern is managing your inflammatory load over time, fried foods are best consumed fresh and not saved for the next day as leftovers to be reheated. Now, I want to give you one more layer here that goes beyond the 5 specific foods on this list, because there is an underlying principle that ties all of this together, and I think it is the most important thing I want you to take away from this video. Chronic inflammation and oxidative stress are not dramatic events. They do not announce themselves. Your pancreas does not send you a warning signal when it is under stress. Your cells do not notify you when oxidative damage is accumulating. The feedback loop is silent, and by the time symptoms appear for many serious conditions affecting the pancreas, the disease has often been developing quietly for years. This is why the mainstream conversation about diet is so incomplete. Everyone focuses on the dramatic bad foods, the things that are obviously processed or obviously unhealthy, and they ignore the slow, quiet accumulation of chemical stress that comes from everyday kitchen habits like reheating food the wrong way. I want to put some additional context around the pancreas specifically because I think most people do not have a clear picture of why this organ is worth protecting specifically. The pancreas sits at the center of 2 of your body's most essential functions: blood sugar regulation and digestion. If the pancreas is damaged or diseased, both of those functions are compromised. And because of where the pancreas sits anatomically, tucked behind the stomach and close to major blood vessels and bile ducts, conditions that affect the pancreas are notoriously difficult to detect early. Pancreatic cancer, in particular, has one of the lowest early detection rates of any major cancer, largely because the pancreas is not easily visualized or biopsied, and because early-stage disease produces very few noticeable symptoms. I am not saying this to frighten you. I am saying it to give you context for why reducing the environmental contributors to pancreatic stress is worth taking seriously. We cannot control our genetics. We cannot always control our environment, but we can control our daily food handling habits. And those habits, sustained consistently over years, do make a measurable difference to our body's overall inflammatory burden. Let me also talk briefly about something that most people do not think about at all, which is the role of food storage in all of this. Because reheating is only half the equation. How food is stored between cooking and reheating matters enormously. Airtight containers reduce oxidation of stored food. Every time food is exposed to air in the fridge, the fats in that food are oxidizing slowly. A loosely covered bowl of leftover fried rice is accumulating oxidative changes even while sitting cold in the refrigerator. Sealed containers meaningfully slow that process. Temperature matters as well. A refrigerator set too warm, above 40 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius, allows bacterial growth to occur at a much faster rate than a properly cold fridge. Many people have refrigerators set warmer than they realize, particularly in older appliances. An inexpensive refrigerator thermometer is a worthwhile investment and can tell you immediately whether your fridge is functioning in the safe range. The depth and density of how food is stored also affects cooling speed. A deep container of dense food like stew or thick rice takes much longer to reach safe refrigerator temperature all the way to the center than a shallow container of the same food. During that longer cooling time, the conditions are favorable for bacterial growth, even though the food is technically in the fridge. Shallow containers are better for storing any leftover that is warm or dense. And the timeline of storage matters. Leftovers in the fridge are generally considered safe for 3 to 4 days. Beyond that, even with proper storage, the risk profile changes significantly. Most people push this limit regularly without thinking about it because the food looks and smells fine. But appearance and smell are not reliable indicators of safety, particularly for the kinds of bacterial toxins we talked about with rice, which are completely odorless and invisible. Now, let me give you some practical tools that you can actually implement starting today, because the point of all of this is not to make you afraid of your kitchen. The point is to give you a clear, simple, actionable framework that reduces your body's daily inflammatory load over time without requiring you to change everything about how you cook or eat. First principle, cool it fast. Any cooked food that is going to be stored should be in the fridge within 1 hour of finishing cooking. For large batches of dense food, spread it into shallow containers to speed up cooling before refrigerating. Do not put a hot pot directly into the fridge and assume it is now safe. The center of that pot may not reach safe temperature for several hours. Second principle, store it sealed. Airtight containers reduce oxidation during storage. This applies to everything, but especially to anything that contains fat. Oils oxidize in the presence of air, even at refrigerator temperatures. Third principle, reheat it once. This is the simplest and most impactful rule. Whatever you are reheating, only heat the portion you are going to eat right now. Do not heat the entire container and then put half of it back. Heat what you need and leave the rest cold and sealed. Fourth principle, heat it evenly and thoroughly. Uneven reheating creates cold spots where bacteria can survive. Stir, rotate, or cut food into smaller pieces before reheating to ensure even heat distribution. Use a thermometer if you want certainty, especially with poultry. Fifth principle, be mindful of color when reheating starchy foods. Darker means more acrylamide, lighter means less. Aim for warm, not rebrowned. Sixth principle, do not reuse frying oil repeatedly. 1 or 2 uses for fresh, high-quality oil in a high-heat application is a reasonable limit. Beyond that, the oxidation compounds accumulate to a level where the oil is doing more harm than good. Now, I also want to address something that comes up frequently when I talk about topics like this, which is the objection that food safety information keeps changing and that everything is bad for you if you read enough studies. I hear that pushback, and I understand it. The health information landscape is genuinely confusing and often contradictory. But here is the distinction I want you to hold on to. The mechanisms we have talked about today are not speculative. Oxidative stress is a well-established biological process. The role of acrylamide and nitrosamines as probable carcinogens is based on decades of rigorous research from some of the most respected scientific bodies in the world. The behavior of Bacillus cereus and heat-stable toxins in rice is basic, well-understood food science that has been consistently documented in food safety literature for decades. This is